Hello, and welcome to a Wilson Center post-election special event. What does the world expect of President-elect Joe Biden? Hi, I'm John Molesky. We're going to provide you with a tour around the world. You'll hear from experts on several continents who will provide on-the-ground reactions to the election of Joe Biden. But first, we're going to begin right here in Washington, D.C., closer to home. Our guest is Jane Harman, the president, director, and CEO of the Wilson Center. Jane is herself a former member of Congress who has seen a number of close elections. She's standing by with Duncan Wood. Duncan is the vice president for new initiatives and the director of the Mexico Institute. He'll be speaking with Jane. Take it away, Duncan.
Jane, thanks for talking with me today. It's great to be here with you. Let's begin with the election, of course, which is on everybody's minds. It's been a drawn-out process. To some degree, it has shown the strengths of the American electoral system and the importance of the rule of law. On the other hand, of course, the uncertainty and the delay in formalizing a winner has posed a risk. How do you see this election playing out in terms of relations with allies and rivals alike? And if I may, perhaps we could begin this by talking a little bit about your own personal experience as a candidate for re-election to Congress in 1994, when it took 5 weeks to certify the results. And ultimately, you won by quite a narrow margin, 812 votes over Mayor Susan Brooks in what was a highly Republican year.
That's true. Well, let me say how proud of the Wilson Center I am to do this whole event over the next weeks, and how smart the people at the Wilson Center, including you, are. In 1994, my first re-election, I was down 200 votes, 250 votes on election night. They stopped counting. There were 10,000 uncounted absentee ballots, and over the next 2 weeks, with observers on both sides, they were counted. It took another 3 weeks to certify my race. So I have my personal experience with these very close elections. And what happened after that was my opponent challenged it a bit longer and finally gave up. I was certified, and I served my second term in Congress and went on to serve 9 terms. With respect to this race, this challenge is really unprecedented. The race has been called. It's very clear that the margins are high in many states, and that ultimately Vice President Biden will be respected as president-elect. In fact, he is around the world. I just add one more thing, Duncan, which is that over the years, I've been an election observer in many countries around the world, including Chile, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Egypt, Tunisia, Afghanistan, and all these places have had trouble with election process. And while I was there, it never occurred to me that my own country would be setting a bad example. So now what? With allies and friends, we need to get on with this. The president-elect needs to have a legal transition, which the current president should be allowing. And he needs to articulate his strategy going forward, and there needs to be a seamless transition in about 70 days. And I think the Biden administration view of world alliances is very different, and I think our allies will happily welcome us back.
That's great. Yes, I think we all hope for a speedy resolution to this. If we can look ahead now for a second, whilst at the same time looking back, for the past 4 years, we've been in an era of economic nationalism, not just here in the United States, but around the world. Here in the US, we've had the America First doctrine. Let me ask you, how do you think that this will change under a Biden administration, in particular under his stated approach of Build Back Better? And secondly, is America back on the global stage, as President-elect Biden said the other day? If not, what are the risks in the short, medium, and long term?
Well, let's start with Build Back Better. The key word in Build Back Better is better. We have finally begun to understand that globalization, which we all hailed as a magic remedy for a better world, isn't better necessarily. It certainly isn't better for a lot of people. A lot more people have been left out of globalization than were part of the pre-globalized economy. And the challenge now is to include those people. And I think the Biden administration gets that. It's not going to happen on January 21st. It's going to happen with a long-term strategy with our allies and trading partners. So what do I see? I see that economic populism will stick around worldwide until we have inclusive globalization. And I think Biden has a strategy for that. And I think he has a great economic team. And I also think he will listen to his team. And we have some starts. Let's give the Trump administration some credit for USMCA, the Mexico-Canada agreement, which is an improvement on NAFTA. Trump is right about that. And which builds in technology as part of the arrangements among Canada, Mexico, and the US, and which would not have happened without him pushing and without bipartisan support from Democrats. But that's a start. If we could replicate that, rejoin some of the alliances we dropped out of, I'm still hoping for TPP in Asia. And I think the world economy and the inclusive economy will build quickly, and economic populism will recede.
Well, I think you provided me with a perfect segue to my final question for you, Jane. Part of my new brief at the Wilson Center is to oversee the spotlight issues that we have. And one of those is great power competition. I wonder if you could give us your vision of how you see this developing over the next 4 years, and how the United States can strengthen its position on the world stage. Specifically, perhaps you could comment on the need for a bipartisan approach to this crucial issue.
Well, I think we need a bipartisan approach to every issue. And I have been just tragically disappointed over many years that bipartisanship has receded in the United States Congress and in Washington. But on this subject, I think we focused too long after 9/11, which was 19 years ago, on the terror threat to the United States. There still is a terror threat, both outside and inside the United States. Right-wing militias, according to many observers, are also a terror threat. But we neglected China's rise, and we neglected Russia's mischief. And so it was smart of the Trump administration, especially under the leadership of Secretary of Defense Mattis, to come up with a new national security strategy, which identified Russia and China as strategic competitors. Both of those words matter, strategic and competitor. We don't have a strategy yet to deal with either one of them. And the goal was to keep them separate, which hasn't happened. And we don't have a goal to compete effectively with either one of them. The China problem's harder because China has a robust economy, Russia doesn't. But nonetheless, a big challenge for the Biden administration, and again, with a very good experienced team, will be to fill out the contours of that strategy and to make the US finally, with our allies, strategic competitors of China and Russia. And I think the world has to accept the fact that we are not the only superpower, that this is a multipolar world, and articulating how we navigate this is going to be tricky. And again, it's another opportunity for the Wilson Center with our in-house geniuses, as I call all of you, to think through these hard problems and come up with actionable ideas.
Jane, this is obviously an area where you could talk for hours and hours and hours, particularly if we had a good tequila to share. But you know, that our time is up. Let me just take this opportunity to thank you for everything that you do for us at the Wilson Center, and of course, for everything you've done in your long and distinguished career.
Well, thank you, Duncan, and thank you for what you do at the Wilson Center and your sort of multicultural approach to things, and the fact that in your own family there is new life. And let's think about why we're doing this. We're doing this for future generations. We want to leave them a better world. My generation hasn't done so well in terms of making the world better, but I'm counting on you, and I'm still counting on me to do better in the next years.
Jane Harman, thank you very much. Back over to you, John.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Jane. We continue our world tour, staying right here in the Western Hemisphere, turning our sights south of the U.S. border to Latin America. The director of our Latin American program, Cynthia Arnson, is standing by, and she has a special guest who will provide a regional perspective. Over to you, Cindy.
Hi, I am pleased to welcome a good friend and colleague, Daniel Zovato, who is the regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean at International IDEA. Daniel, how do you think the next administration is going to be viewed in Latin America?
Cindy, thank you so much for having me. In my view, Biden's victory is viewed by most government and scholars in the region, I will say, with a moderate optimism. And there are good reasons for that. On the one hand, Biden knows very well the region and cares for the region. And on the other hand, the region knows quite well Biden. So, of course, Latin America will not be a priority for Biden. Biden will have to pay a lot of attention to domestic issues, but there is the expectation from Latin America that we can expect a more predictable and strategic approach from Biden, a new policy that will emphasize mutual respect, multilateral dialogue, and regional cooperation. And so far, if we analyze the reaction of the different presidents in the region, we see that many of the presidents have already recognized Biden's victory and also congratulate him and express the interest to work with him, with two big exceptions. That is Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, and López Obrador, the president of Mexico, that these two leaders have not yet recognized Biden's victory. Also, it's very important to see which has been the reaction coming from the three authoritarian regimes, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And the three leaders have recognized Biden's victory and expressed the interest to reset in a more positive terms the relation with Biden.
Thanks. You mentioned the word expectations. If the new President-elect Biden can only do a few things in the region, what would they be? And what do you think really should be the thematic priorities for the next US president?
Cindy, I see four main priorities. Number one, helping Latin America to combat the coronavirus pandemic. Second, investing in the economic and social recovery of the region. Third, increasing the democratic resilience and at the same time improving the political stability of the region. And four, I will say it will be very important for Biden's administration to try to balance the role of China in the region. Of course, there are other issues like to have a new approach for immigration and also to give more attention to climate change. And two final comments on this. Next year, in the United States will take place the Summit of the Americas. So I think that this is going to be a very good opportunity from both sides, from the United States and from Latin America, to really put in place this common agenda and to really, I will say, strengthen the leadership from both sides in order to really put in place a good strategic partnership.
Thanks. And aside from those thematic priorities, which are pretty broad and all inclusive, are there specific countries that you think should be the focus of US attention?
Yes, I think that if we go from north to south, I will put as a first priority, of course, Mexico. Biden recently said that he is planning to have an early meeting with López Obrador in order to develop a joint economic and security strategy to undo the immigration policy of Trump. Second, the countries in the Northern Triangle, particularly regarding the issue of immigration. Third, Colombia, that according to Biden is the keystone of any foreign policy of the United States and Latin America. And I would say fourth, in the case of Brazil, particularly with the key issue of the deforestation of the Amazon, and at the same time, probably later on, the issue of human rights. But also, I think that Biden will have to pay particular attention how to deal with Cuba and with Venezuela. Both are very sensitive countries and issues for the internal domestic electoral issues in the United States, as we saw in the last November election, and the case of Nicaragua. So I think that these, in my view, are the key countries where a new foreign policy of Biden will have to pay special attention.
Neil, thanks so much. There's obviously much more we could discuss, but we have a limited amount of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for your invitation, Cindy.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks, Danielle. We're now going to turn our sights to Europe and check in on the Atlantic Alliance. Standing by is Dan Hamilton, who is director of the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. He has a guest from Germany. Dan, take it away.
Hi, I'm here with Norbert Röttgen, who's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the German Bundestag, the German Parliament. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. Mr. Rutkin, let me ask you your impressions you have seen in Germany and in Europe in response to the US elections.
Hello, Dan, good to see you, and thank you for having me. I think I clearly say that in a way, collectively, there was a big breath of relief and joy across the country that now with Joe Biden, we see a new opportunity for the transatlantic partnership in the future.
There seems to be a whole outburst in Europe sort of reflecting that mood, but we still have difficulties across the Atlantic. If you think about issues we have to face, there's US challenges to the German Nord Stream 2 energy project. There's President Trump had announced troop withdrawals from Germany. There's a question of how we together should work or not on China and what its rise means for each of us. How we work on defense spending. You know, there's been a general US sense that Germany hasn't spent as much on defense as it should. Do you think those problems will be easier to deal with or harder, or how do you think we should go about that?
No, I would say what I think is most important is that the general approach of the United States, of Joe Biden and his administration can be expected to be completely different. We will see again the mutual appreciation of the alliance. He will turn again towards the world and he will be active in foreign policy. And we will treat each other as partners and friends. However, of course, there are still problems. And some of the differences between the German / European view and the American view are in the United States bipartisan issues. So there's no struggle within the US. For example, Nord Stream 2 has been opposed both by Republicans and Democrats, and it has been opposed all the time by me, for example. But what is different, that there are really opportunities if and when there is an administration who wants to be active on the world stage. For example, climate policy, external climate policy, a strategy vis-a-vis. However, of course, this is demanding also for Europe and Germany particularly. So we have to bring in our special trade policy vis-a-vis China into a European strategy on China and into a transatlantic approach. For example, the 5G decision will be the first example whether we are ready to slightly shift our position towards a Western transatlantic position.
Do you think that the China debate will be easy? And so far, until now, the Trump administration has been tough on China. As you say, there's sort of a bipartisan approach that that's sort of the direction to go. He had also sort of beat up on allies to try to get them online. When you say you see a new way of dealing with it, how do you see that? Where are the areas where the U.S. and Europe maybe could work together when we consider how to approach China?
So I think technology is an important area because the global competition, the great power competition which has re-emerged on the world stage, has more and more a technological basis. So this is an area where we can put together strengths on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think in general, we could more agree. We do not want to wage trade wars. We do not think that we have to embrace a hostility, a bipolar world towards China, but we have to strengthen our strengths and then go for a common position vis-a-vis China. I think this will then bear fruits. And I think also a certain division of labor between the United States and Europe, with the pivot to Asia by the US and China very much focusing on China, and with a responsibility for Europe, for itself, for the Eastern and Southern neighborhood. I think there are many, many areas where we have to go and we Europeans and Germans particularly have to move, but we have made an experience now under Trump. So we should be very motivated to fill in more European substance in our relationship.
One last question about the defense spending issue, which you know has also been sort of very controversial. It was actually the Obama-Biden administration that set the 2% spending goal that countries, NATO allies should spend 2% of their GDP on defense. It wasn't Donald Trump. So with the vice president returning to the presidency, what do you think Germany is going to deal with? How is Germany going to deal with this question? It's coupled also to the issue of troops, troop presence in Germany and Europe. What do you say now? It's hard, you know, I think for 330 million Americans to understand why 500 million Europeans really don't, you know, carry their fair share of the defense burden. That's sort of a general impression in the United States. What do you say to that?
My view is, and I'm vocal on this in the German public and in Europe, that the Americans are right. Yes, we have to come to a new agreement on a division of labor. We have to care as Europeans and Germans more for our own security. The Cold War is 30 years over now, and we see everybody across Europe sees the domestic dramatic challenges of the new president. So we simply have to do more, find a new deal about security and Europe. And I think we will have now a better approach. The withdrawal of troops was, in my view, more or less an irrational act of punishment of Germany against the security interests of the United States. So I think this could be reconsidered, and Germany should reconsider its pace of living up to the pledges we have made to European and NATO security.
Thank you. Norbert Röttgen, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the German Bundestag. Thank you so much for being with us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Norbert. Our next stop is Russia, a country that has certainly been a major player in U.S. politics in many ways over the last several years. Matt Rajansky is director of the Kennan Institute. He's standing by with his guest. Take it away, Matt.
Well, it's great to be able to talk with one of Russia's leading America watchers, Victoria Zhuravyova, who is the head of the Center for North American Studies at IMMO, Russia's largest and one of its oldest and best known think tanks. Victoria, just tell me first, what do Russians make of what has just happened in the United States, both how the campaign and the election went and then the result?
First of all, thank you for this invitation, for this opportunity. And when you are talking about Russians, we have Russian expert, Russian society, and Russian government, and all they are different in their emotions and their thinking about American elections. Because for Russian society, it is something very strange is going on, because when you don't know for 3-4 days what will be, who will be the next president, it's very strange for Russians. So it is the focus of media discussion, the question whether it is democracy. So if you cannot choose your president, so why we are talking about democracy in the United States? Very in this sort, I would say, in this stream of a little bit anti-Americanism, which is unfortunately high today in Russia, at least in media Russia. Then on the level of the government, it is a sense of waiting for the new president, waiting for the results, and I would say there is a short of expectation at all. So which they are just waiting and watching, and that's all. And for the experts, it is, as an expert, I would say it is very, very, very interesting to see what is going on. It is so a picture of this divided country, which is really divided. And the results of the election show this divide is so deep when really half of the country voted for Biden and almost half voted for Trump, and how the system can realize it and can give a result of this divide, and what will be the next elections when if it there are a lot of questions about it, whether it is a new normality for United States, whether every election would be like this, when you cannot when no candidate can be for sure a leader candidate, and he always should ask whether he will win, or we will have a situation with courts and Supreme Court, etc. And very interesting situation with Trump, with his trying to stay in White House no matter what. And so it's like, it's like a show which is still go on and go on and go on. And at the same time, as a person, I'm really very empathic for those who voted for Biden and who now have his their dream goes realized, and really this I can feel this hope that something will change.
You mentioned
will change in the country.
Victoria, you mentioned the deeply divided country, but actually one issue that has brought Democrats and Republicans together over the last 3 or 4 years is Russia, right? Sanctions
Absolutely.
against Russia, condemnation of Russia, almost anything conflict with Russia, you get unity. What are expectations from Russia? How do Russians read the signals of a Biden administration potentially coming in and somehow changing policy, but also still a Republican Senate, right? So divided government. What do Russians think this will mean for them?
I think that this time, as for if we are talking about Russian government, for this time there is no expectation, and because it was there were too much of expectation 4 years ago, and then too much of disappointment. So this time they are staying calm and just waiting for the first steps. As for the experts, I would say that there is so very popular. It's a sort of a fear, that it is now Democrats in White House, and Democrats that are traditionally more focused on issues like human rights, on liberal democracy, etc. And so we should wait for something for Russian agenda will be more focused on these issues. And
so let me ask this.
It would be more difficult.
The centerpiece of U.S.-Russia disagreement, at least since 2016, has been the issue of interference. On the U.S. side, of course, the allegation of Russia trying to interfere with presidential elections, congressional elections, stir up disagreements, the partisanship that you mentioned. And then the Russian side, of course, seems to believe that U.S. democracy promotion is also a kind of interference or a desire to promote color revolutions, et cetera. Do you feel like this election in any way calms that issue down, kind of puts the issue to bed or to rest? Or do you foresee that being a big problem in the future? And if it's a problem, what do we do about it?
I would say that it is still an issue for Democratic Party, and I wouldn't expect that they will put it away and especially taking into consideration that Senate still will be controlled by Republican Party. So this issue of Russian interference could be one of a unity issue. So something from unity agenda, from from both party agenda, something that they could agree on.
Right.
So I would wait that it will stay in the agenda, in Russian agenda.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Victoria. I appreciate your quick reactions, and as little as we know, you certainly gave us a great window into what Russians are thinking and how they're watching this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt and Victoria. Our next stop is the Middle East. Marissa Kerma is the manager of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Her guest will provide a regional perspective. Marissa, over to you.
We're pleased to be hosting Rami Khouri, who is a former Wilson Fellow and currently Director of Global Engagement at the American University of Beirut, also a columnist with Agence Global Syndicate and the New Arab in London, as well as a non-resident fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School to talk about the Middle East and the new Biden administration. Thank you, Rami, for being here. So I'll start with a very simple question. What are the greatest challenges that will be facing the Biden administration in the Middle East and North Africa region?
The one overall greatest challenge is really to come to grips with the realities of the tremendous changes that are taking place all across the Middle East. That's the Arab world, Turkey, Israel, and Iran. The Arab world, the Middle East, is very different now than it was even when Biden was vice president a few years ago only. The administration has to understand the global changes. The Arab world is a region of paupers. 75% of Arabs are poor and vulnerable. There is tremendous citizen discontent. There's uprisings and revolutionary uprisings across the region that have been going on for 10 years nonstop. There is a huge problem with citizen government relationships. There's more authoritarian governments across the region using violence against their own people. There's huge penetration of foreign actors, the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, the Americans, and the British and the French have always been there. And now you've got Arabs themselves, like the Emiratis and the Saudis and others, sending troops around the region, like in Yemen or Libya and other places. So this is a region in great tumult and turmoil to a large extent. And the reason is that there has never been a mechanism by which the citizens of these countries, in the Arab world at least, can really have a say in how they run their countries. And this creates big problems in terms of stability, in terms of sovereignty, and this opens up the opportunities for foreigners to come in with their weapons, including the Americans who come in with their weapons all the time and still do now. That's the big picture that the Biden administration really needs to come to grips with. When you look at specific issues, you've got the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has been going on for 100 years, and is a main driver a lot of the problems in the region. You have the Iranian situation, you have the expanded militarism of the Saudis and the Emiratis, you have citizen stresses and tensions and rebellions across many countries, economic stagnation. All of these individual issues can be looked at, but they all form this regional legacy that I just mentioned.
So you said in terms of the specific challenges, the Arab-Israeli challenge, do you think it is still framed as an Arab-Israeli challenge, given that we've seen two Arab Gulf countries sign normalization deals with Israel just a month and a half ago?
Yeah, we didn't have countries sign deals, we had individual leaders sign deals. And the Sudanese, you had half the Sudanese government, the military side, signed a deal. So these are not peace agreements between countries. These are political arrangements between individual leaders who, for their own interests, find that they would want to be on good terms with Israel for many reasons which they can explain to the world, and they'll have to explain to history and to their own people eventually. These agreements have very little impact on what's going on in the region right now. In fact, they're a consequence of it. They're a consequence of leaderships that feel less secure, that are afraid of the US pulling out of the region slowly. They're afraid of power changes in the region with the Turks and the Iranians and others getting more powerful. And therefore, they're looking around who can help them, keep them safe. What they should be doing is looking to their own people, because that's where your ultimate security comes from. A satisfied, engaged, politically empowered citizenry is the only guarantee of long-term stability. So these agreements that the Emiratis and Bahrainis and half the Sudanese government did with Israel are not very significant in the broader picture.
And what about you mentioned the Iranian challenge as being the second greatest challenge. How do you see the new Biden administration approaching Iran differently than what we've seen in the last 4 years with the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy?
Biden's going to have to explore how to overcome the legacy of Trump, which is simply that nobody will trust the United States like they used to. If the US signs an agreement, people are going to say, well, why should we trust you? Look what Trump did. He broke all these agreements, the climate change, the Iran deal. He left some UN agencies. So the challenge for Biden is to talk with the Iranians, talk to the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, all the interested parties that came together to negotiate the agreement 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and find out what it is that everybody wants, and then negotiate in a way that gives everybody their bottom line. So it's a win-win for everybody, and then they're all inclined to keep that agreement for a long time. I think it's a doable deal. The Iranians are reasonable people. They negotiated one deal already, and they will do another one, but only if they get what they want, which is above all respect, to be treated equally and respectfully, not to be sanctioned and threatened and attacked and taken advantage of and accused of all kinds of things, but to be treated with respect, and then to be treated according to international law. And that's what Obama and Biden did with their partners around the world, and that's why they reached that agreement. It's going to be time-consuming to regain that credibility that the U.S. has now lost. And also many of the partners of the U.S. around the world, in Europe and other places, they're going to want to see the U.S. reestablish its seriousness as a global power. They know the U.S. is a serious global military power because that's all it does. It goes around the world attacking people and sanctioning people and threatening people, and drones and missiles and cruise missiles. And that they know the U.S. is powerful, but what they want is political credibility. And this is something that Biden should be pretty good at, and depends on who he chooses in his team.
Great. Thank you very much, Brahim Khouri, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Marissa and Rami. Our journey now takes us to the world's second largest and second most populous continent, Africa. Monde Muyangwa is the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. She has a guest who will provide a regional perspective. Monde.
My name is Monde Muyangwa. I am delighted to welcome Tom Boyer to give us a perspective from Africa on how the continent views the recent US elections and a potential Biden administration. I'm especially delighted to have this discussion with Tom, as this is a follow-on to our 2015 discussion following then President Obama's visit to the continent. So Tom, welcome, and let's get right to it.
Thank you very much.
Could you tell us how the continent views this bite of an election that we just had in this country? What are the reactions from the continent?
Indeed, it has been a nail-biter of an election, and one which, by many accounts, may not be over yet. If anything that we see in the media is an indication of that. what we're seeing is that, the political and societal divisions have been laid bare over the last couple of years in the US, and that these have culminated in a very deeply divisive campaign and election period, which I think is probably taking its toll on Americans in general. Monde, as you know, as a continent, we've seen our fair share of electoral crises here in Africa. So we recognize one when we see one. The types of divisions and electoral contestation that we're witnessing are not unique to Africa. What we're seeing is that they do happen in other parts of the world as well. But I think that the important thing and the important question is how we resolve these issues, how our institutions deal with them, and how people respond. These are the important things, and so Africa, I think, will be very keenly watching to see how the US is able to resolve these issues, and especially the current electoral situation.
Sure.
Beyond that situation, the legalities of the electoral situation itself, I think it also goes further, and another similarity with Africa is that the US will now have to face the fact that there are very deep-rooted societal divisions that need to be dealt with. Even once the dust has settled on the election, these issues won't go away. So it will require some very proactive measures, discussions, and deliberation to be able to deal with those issues. And I'm sure that all Africans, myself included, will wish our brothers and sisters in the US the very best in that regard.
Thank you, Tom. I think that's a really good segue into the next question, which is, as you look across the continent at official reactions and reactions from ordinary Africans, what do you think the continent is hoping for from a Biden administration, should that prevail in the courts?
I think what the continent is hoping for from a Biden administration is perhaps a return to normalcy. What do I mean by that? Well, just to put it a little bit in context, Africa has enjoyed a very long-standing relationship with the US. I'm happy to say that in the case of my own country here in Kenya, both the government and the peoples of our two countries enjoy a long history of very, very cordial relations. And again, in the case of Kenya, more than 55 years of diplomatic relations. So I think really what Kenya and Africa are expecting from a Biden administration is the opportunity to be able to build on that very, very long history of relations. There are indeed many who will feel that under a Trump administration, that parts of Africa fell off the radar, as it were, and that Africa was no longer a priority. So that, in this sense, his administration may have been something of a disruption to the normal course of relations between Africa and the US. So I suspect what many Africans would like to see is simply this return to normalcy, to continue to build upon the relations that we have been building upon for so long now.
All right. Thank you. And final question, if you could give the Biden administration the list of the top 3 issues that they should focus on when it comes to Africa, what would those 3 issues be?
Let me first say that, yes, I do have 3 issues I'd like to highlight, but there's nothing new here. So I guess in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that I don't think a Biden administration needs to reinvent the wheel. They simply need to look at where Africa and the US have been working together, the collaboration that has existed, and build upon that. So the first key issue for me is healthcare. We are in the midst of a pandemic, as you well know, a global pandemic. But even before that, the US has always been a very, very strong partner with Africa, working with African countries to improve particularly public health care. With the COVID-19 pandemic, this has just highlighted the need on the continent to be able to make greater efforts towards improving public health care, but also the ability of our healthcare systems to better deal with not only pandemics, but also the health requirements, the ongoing health requirements of our people and populations. The second issue, I would say, is trade. I think we are sensing a shift, moving away from an over-reliance on aid to trade. We're very well aware that Africa does have a tremendous amount to bring to the table. So I think that the mutual interests of the African and US private sectors has a significant amount of potential to be able to create jobs and fuel economic growth, and thereby unlocking opportunities for the benefit of all involved. The last issue I'd like to raise is peace and security, which again is one issue that the US and Africa have been working together with for quite some time, and that collaboration has grown significantly. Security challenges on the continent are inextricably linked to the national security of the US. And this is something that's been researched and well spoken about. And this is also due to the globalized security environment in which we all live. So therefore, improving the ability of countries on the African continent to be able to address issues such as transnational security, I think, is paramount. And in dealing with these issues is a benefit not just to the individual country, not just to the region, but also to the global community at large.
All right. Thank you so much, Tom. We appreciate that perspective from the continent, and we look forward to having you back again at some point. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Monday and Tom. Our next stop is China. In her interview, Jane Harmon spoke of strategic competitors, and China certainly tops that list. So here to speak with a guest from China is the director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute, Robert Daly. Hi, Robert.
Hello, I'm here today with Dr. Tung Zhao, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Dr. Tung, could you tell us how the election has been viewed in China? I know that there's a vast array of views in China, and there are different groups, but we'd be particularly interested in how China's leaders, how its elite groups, and ordinary Chinese have watched the American election.
I think for the top leadership, their view is very power-centric. For them, who wins the election doesn't really matter. What matters is that China continues to focus on its own efforts to build up its comprehensive national power, because at the end of the day, it's the relative balance of power between China and the United States that is going to matter. And if China can continue to strengthen itself, and the US will have to respect China by the time China becomes much more powerful than today. For the general public, I think they take a very relaxed attitude. They feel the situation here in China is good, life is good. So they are basically like watching a movie with popcorns, enjoying the debating. They make bets about who are going to win. Many people are going to treat their friends for many meals and drinks in the next few months. So they are entertaining themselves. Of course, some people are worried students. They want to get visa to go to the United States. Business people, they want a normal business environment. I think the most divisive group is the elites, because they care about what happens in the United States. They care about the differences between the Chinese and American systems, and they are more likely to access American media and information. And interestingly, they are also most susceptible to the influence of misinformation, conspiracy theories. So they are very divided in the sense that many really subscribe to conspiracy theories. They argue with each other whether this is a fair election. But I think at the end of the day, the elites, they feel that it is important to prepare for a Biden administration. The US system is basically bankrupt. So it's a very interesting domestic environment in China looking at the American election.
I'd like to follow up on your last comment. It's often suggested in the United States that even though other world powers may have mixed views about who actually wins the election, nevertheless, Russia, China, Iran, perhaps, see themselves as benefiting from and actually take pleasure in seeing the chaos in the American election system. Could you talk a little bit about how Chinese view that and the credibility of American institutions in light of both the way the campaign was run and the aftermath of the election?
Yeah, I think the Chinese generally think the US is clearly in decline. The chaos following the election is another evidence. Not only the political chaos, but also the rapid rising numbers of COVID infection cases every day. It looks like no one is taking care of the people. And it's also the impression of many Chinese people that the election proves that the American system is really corrupt. The politicians are hypocritical, they are very selfish, they prioritize self and party interests over national interests. And this further diminishes the appealingness of American system in the Chinese general public. And I think some Chinese decision makers may draw the conclusion that there may be even greater need to impose control on media, especially social media, simply to prevent a similar domestic chaos in China. So it would be harder for the US to lecture China on a free media, etc. It's going to make the ideological competition between them and China much more intensive in the future.
That while there's doubt about American democracy and there's a belief in American decline, as you said, Chinese believe the American system is bankrupt. And yet people are very interested in the American election. They follow it more closely than they do elections in other countries. It becomes, as you say, friends bet, they take each other to dinner. There is still this kind of fascination from the Chinese with the American system and the elections. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's so much interest?
Well, I think it's, first, I think people believe the stakes are relatively high. They all view the United States as the primary geopolitical rival for China. So China's future partly depends on how the United States does and the American policy on China. And the American domestic politics is just becoming increasingly intriguing to the Chinese audience. There is so much surprise. There are there are dramas every day, so it's entertaining to many Chinese audience.
Dr. Tung Zhao, thank you very much for being with us.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks, Robert, and really thanks to everyone. Those were terrific, fascinating stuff. And now we're going to reassemble our all-stars from the Wilson Center, bring them back for a roundtable discussion. Avengers Assemble, here we go. Hi, everybody. Again, great job on the interviews. So a number of themes emerged, but let's start with the overall theme. This is built around expectations. What does the world expect of President-elect Joe Biden? So we saw a range within your interviews. We saw some people, I would think it might be safe to say that, Dan, in Europe, that was the most celebrating in seeing President Trump go and President-elect Biden prepare to take office. But we certainly didn't see that across the board. So if each of you would maybe begin by talking to us about what you're hearing from the people you're speaking to, from the foreign press that you're following, in terms of expectations, whether they're high, low, or somewhere in between. And Dan, since I tagged you on the reactions of Norbert Röttgen, let's begin with you.
Well, Norbert is running to be Angela Merkel's successor, so he is approaching this with a positive vibe. If I had had a Polish colleague in that interview, the Poles are a little nervous because they have placed a huge bet on Donald Trump. So the reactions in Europe are really across the board. It's not one. I think the mistake many Europeans might make is to sort of wait it out. So to instead of coming to the United States with their expectations of what they're prepared to do with the new administration, to sort of sit back, breathe a sigh of relief, and sort of say we go back to business as usual. I think that's a mistake. I think a new administration won't want to reinvent the transatlantic alliance. It won't want to go back to something that really is no longer really a sustainable basis for a partnership.
Thanks, Dan. Cindy, how about you? I know we got a lot of countries to talk about when we talk about Latin America, so it's impossible to generalize, but even though that's impossible, let's see if you're up to it. Generally speaking, expectations.
Sure. Generally speaking, again, it depends on who you're talking to, as you were saying. President Bolsonaro of Brazil, López Obrador of Mexico, as Daniel Sovato was pointing out, have yet to recognize the Biden victory. And we can pick that apart a lot, but that is true. But overall, I would say that the election of Joe Biden was welcomed. He is seen as someone who knows the region. It is a chance for US policy to go beyond a very narrow set of issues focused on stopping migration from Central America or achieving regime change in Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua, and take on a much broader scope of issues of interest to the region, particularly how to bolster the capacity to overcome the health challenges and the economic challenges that have been caused by the pandemic, to bring climate change issues to the fore, given the number of countries in the region that are being so dramatically impacted by climate change. And in addition to the sort of substance of what might be different, as Danielle was noting, there is just an overall change in tone, in approach, in an emphasis on multilateralism, in diplomacy. So I think overall there is a welcoming of this change, but there is also the sense that relationships could get a lot more complicated as the administration focuses, or as the new administration focuses on things like human rights and democracy, which are certainly challenged in our own country, but certainly under stress in many parts of the region.
Thanks, Cindy. Matt, speaking of complicated relationships, Victoria seemed to be saying Russia doesn't want to get its hopes up again and be disappointed again. What are the expectations?
So I think Russia is a great example, John, of what you might call cockeyed optimism. The relationship is so bad and so dysfunctional, really, short of being in overt military conflict, which would so quickly escalate to an unacceptable level of nuclear risk and truly kind of world-ending confrontation. We've gone as far as we can. We have eroded the diplomatic relationships so far. We've eroded the trade and the people-to-people relationships so far. There's not a lot left. Now, that said, the Russian version of optimism might be it could always get worse. And so I think what you hear from Russian observers is kind of confirmation bias. Those who from the outset were very hawkish about the United States, the so-called siloviki, the people in the power ministries, defense and the uniformed services and the intelligence community in Russia, for them, Joe Biden is in the same mold as Hillary Clinton or John McCain. In other words, it doesn't matter about the party. It only matters that this is the American establishment, and there's going to be more of the same, more conflict. And hey, that's good for business if you're a Silovik in Russia. But the confirmation bias applies just as much to the kind of technocrats and the more Western-oriented folks who will say, well, it's been such chaos because of the conflict between Trump and the distrust between the Congress and Trump over the last 4 years. That's why we've seen this much more active congressional sanctions policy. If we can at least return to the status quo ante, we had big disagreements with the United States in the late Obama years, but we could at least talk to each other about things that we had to talk to each other about, like space, like the Arctic, nuclear arms control, and so on. And there, the fact that Biden is projecting extension of the New START agreement, continued strategic stability dialogue, these are staples of Moscow-Washington relations, literally going back to the middle of the 20th century. And I think that those pragmatic Russians welcome that. And again, they take that Russian optimism of, it could be worse.
It depends where you're starting from. Monday, Tom Mambayo made a point about African expectations in that they just like to see the U.S. pay a little more attention to Africa. Does that sum it up?
Yeah, I think so to some extent. I think he has a very good point there. I think many cases, when we look across the continent, what they are looking at is more hope for what a Biden administration would do rather than any expectations. And I think there's a little bit of a difference of opinion whether, that have been on the periphery of US national interests. And President Trump was the first person to really just let it slip and show it for what it really was. While others are saying, having said that there was some modicum of partnership and engagement before, perhaps not Africans would have liked it to be. And that's that hope that they have that at least, we can return to that normalcy under a Biden administration. And so it's more about hope rather than expectations. I don't think expectations are very high, but there's hope that something good will come out of a Biden administration. And then I think secondly, on the normalcy a bit, look, I think many Africans feel like they've been on the receiving end of a lot of negativity out of Washington, whether it has been some of the unfortunate language that was used in describing African countries early on in the administration, whether it is African leaders in various organizations singled out, the current head of the World Health Organization, who has been criticized at every turn, the US blocking the nominee for the World Trade Organization, the US sanctioning the head of the ICC, and most of all, watching the tone and representation and attacks on President Obama, who has roots in Africa over the last few years. So I think Africans just have this sense of, can we return to normal, even in terms of just the language of diplomacy that we use, the engagement that we have, just showing a little bit of respect for the continent, and also just trying to build on some of the previous partnerships that existed. And then finally, I think Africans have been very concerned that under the current national security strategy that we have, that the administration has viewed Africa more as a Chinese outpost, has viewed Africa through the lens of what China is doing, great power competition, and that this has come at a cost of what US-Africa relations could be. And so just asking the administration to step back and revisit that whole strategic approach of looking at Africa through a Chinese lens, that there's more to Africa than just that. And so there's hope that a Biden administration will just engage with both the challenges and the opportunities that the continent has to offer for itself.
Thanks, Monday. And Marissa, I want to ask you not just about expectations in general regionally, but also specifically any expectations that a Biden administration will change the calculus as it relates to Iran.
Thanks, John. Well, in terms of expectations generally, I think they're very much rooted in a very accurate reading of what's happening on the domestic political scene. So many officials that, as well as in the regional press, we've seen sort of an admission that they recognize that the Biden administration will be extremely preoccupied with domestic issues, from COVID to the economy to sowing political divisions in America, that the Middle East will not be a priority. In terms of Iran, yes, there is, I guess, a sigh of relief amongst those who want to re-engage and want to see the United States re-engage. President-elect Biden has spoken about re-engaging in talks with Iran. So of course, the news was in Iran itself was definitely received with a bit of a sigh of relief that this might end the maximum pressure policy that has severely affected the Iranian economy.
And apparently hasn't worked as far as deterring the nuclear program.
Well, those who are very close Iran watchers could also, have also argued that beyond just not deterring the nuclear program, it has also emboldened many of the hardliners in the regime.
Okay, thanks, Marissa. Robert, a fascinating commentary by Dr. Tong, essentially saying, we're a TV show. We're there for their amusement, an empire in decline. So what are their expectations of us?
Their expectations, I think, have been tempered by closely watching the election process. And they realize that President Joe Biden's style will be very different than President Trump's, but the content of the relationship, a long-term, worldwide, comprehensive competition, this isn't going to change. There's a commitment to this from both Democrats and Republicans, and there are historical and structural reasons that we are where we are with China. Neither President Trump nor Xi Jinping did this. This has been long coming, and now we find ourselves in something still short of a Cold War situation, but one that could yet tip in that direction. So the Chinese know that President Biden will probably, at least early in his administration, bring a lot more certainty to the relationship. His diplomatic rhetoric is more traditional. You won't have deliberate provocations, speeches that sound like insults for insults' sake. They know that President Biden will re-enable the American expert bureaucracy at the State Department, the Defense Department. And when you work through normal policymaking channels, that tends to rub the rough edges off of American policy and slow things down. And that will likely include, in China's view, and I think correctly, some attempt to have new dialogues, either between Biden or the Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping, and even at other levels. So less uncertainty, but really more of the same. And so China has already accounted for that. And as Professor Zhao Tung said, they're moving ahead on their own priorities. You know, China is writing its own story. They don't see the Biden election as epical. What was epical was China's rise. And that's the engine for Chinese foreign policy going forward. They're aware of American power. They're wary of American power, but they don't see anything that's going to cause them to reconsider their strategies.
One of the most consistent terms used to describe Donald Trump and his administration in regard certainly to foreign policy has been that of disruptor, an agent of disruption. And that emerged in the interviews that you conducted. I'm wondering, is it other words that came up, stability, credibility, trust, winning back trust. What are your thoughts on the heavy lift ahead for the Biden administration in that regard? Some people have said the U.S. can't be trusted as it relates, I think it was Rami Khoury, can't be trusted as it relates to trade agreements or other types of agreements because they might pull out. What are you thinking in that regard? Who'd like to begin?
I'll jump in, John. I think those are absolutely the words that we've heard that cover all the regions. I think what's interesting with regards to the Middle East, that at a minimum, the expectation is that the Biden administration will reset the tone and then focus on issues that are important to the citizenry that Rami Khoury has talked about, who are frustrated, feel disenfranchised, and are taking to the streets to express their frustration and their anger. And so there is, again, a sigh of relief that there will be not necessarily a very proactive, for example, democracy and human rights agenda, but that focus will return and will slowly restore basically faith in America. According to recent surveys of the Arab Barometer, for example, US credibility and perceptions of the US have declined significantly since President Trump was elected. And so people are hoping for a change. Other recent figures have shown just 2 days before the election that in 5 countries in the region, Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, the preference was for a Biden foreign policy for the region. So at a minimum, there is this hope for a change of tone and for an America that, again, restores diplomacy as an arm of foreign policy.
Dan Hamilton, and then we'll come to you, Monday.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the Europeans are expecting a change of tone very much. And I think the administration is likely to provide that right away. In fact, Joe Biden's already talked to most major European leaders and already set that tone. But I think embedded within a different tone are going to be higher expectations of Europe. A new administration is making more of Europe, not less. The tone might be right, but then will come the message. Joe Biden's going to say, we will join the Paris Climate Agreement Accords day one, but I'm going to host a global climate summit with 100 days with a very ambitious agenda, which will actually disrupt the current COP process, the Paris process, which calls for a summit only next fall. And he'll have to align expectations with the Europeans and what that means. He will say, I'm ready to engage again on Iran, but it's not just about Iran's nuclear program. It's also about refusal to recognize the existence of Israel. It's about support for terrorism. It's about its own other activities undermining its neighbors in the region. What do you think, Europe, about that type of approach? And I think on burden sharing in NATO, he will say we have to revise the NATO strategic concept, the guiding document for the alliance to point it into the future. But that's going to require Europe to do more in terms of all of the security challenges that we face together. I'm not sure that Europe is ready for, this type of assertive, it's a positive message, but one that really requires Europe to step up.
Given the number of problems that will face the new administration, it could be a very short honeymoon period, it sounds like. Monde Muyangwa, you're next.
I was just going to say that I think in terms of tone from the Biden administration, I think Africans definitely do expect a different, a much more respectful tone in terms of how the U.S. engages African countries. I think that's consistent across all the 55 countries. That's something that came through very powerfully. On the issue of trust and credibility, that also came through, that Biden administration has a lot of work to do in terms of rebuilding trust and credibility. Just looking, for example, at multilateralism, I think a lot of Africans are hoping that a Biden administration will take a lead in repairing the multilateralism that has been so damaged over the last few years. On issues like COVID, which we're going through right now, that we're going to need some multilateral approaches there to be able to address the pandemic. On issues of trade, on issues of climate change, all of which matter greatly to Africa and other countries, but whose multilateral institutions have kind of been undermined and diminished over the last few years, that they hope a Biden administration would take a different tack to that. And then I think finally, one of the things that African countries are speaking with, both at the official and unofficial level, is that a Biden administration will have to engage with a little bit more humility when it comes to issues of governance. That they have seen over the last few years, the last few months, the challenges have been exposed in terms of governance issues here in the United States. And what they're hoping for is that acknowledges those governance challenges, even as it reasserts its voice on issues of human rights, in issues of democracy, and on issues of justice. That without that humility, it's not going to work. Because so much damage has been done based on the challenges that have been exposed here at home.
Thanks. On this, before we move on from this topic of winning back trust, Cindy, Matt, or Robert, would you like to weigh in on this one? Cindy? Need you to unmute, Cindy.
Tried to do that before.
It's a Zoom tradition, no problem.
Exactly, thank you. Just to follow up on what Monde said, I think a lot of people in Latin America have looked in a certain sense with shock and horror at what's taken place in the United States over these last months. People talk about the Latin Americanization of US politics. The divisions, the casting of opponents as enemies. Anyway, we can go into a big litany, but it will make it more difficult for the United States to do things that it traditionally has done, which is to try to build democracy, to advocate on behalf of human rights. And that voice is very important and will continue to be important, but it can't be in a sort of lecturing or hectoring way, given all of the blemishes of our own process. And I think the person that Monde interviewed used another word that was really critical to this, a return to a sense of normalcy. And I think that's probably where leaders in the region are breathing the greatest sigh of relief, that they feel that they will be able to talk to people, that they're not going to be strong-armed or, have their back pushed against the wall to accept, what it is the United States wants them to do, that there will be a much more collaborative process. And that's an important change.
In the case of China, distrust between the United States and China is already at an all-time high for slightly different reasons than there are issues with American reliability elsewhere. It's not that we have pulled out of treaties or agreements with China that they wanted us to stay in. It's just that we have been pursuing a competition with China. And so what China sees when it looks at the Biden team, they don't speak about building trust with China, but Biden, unlike President Trump, has said that we do need to cooperate with China where our interests align on public health issues, on combating global warming. The question here is whether China is going to be able to cooperate with the United States when we are also competing with China and criticizing China in other areas. This goes against China's grain. They don't like to work with us in one area that they box off if we are making life difficult for them in another. To give one example, candidate Biden said that what China is doing to the Uyghurs out in Xinjiang is genocide. Very clearly, he got out ahead of the Trump administration on that. And I don't think that President Biden can walk that back, nor do I have any reason to think that he wants to walk that back. But if we stay with this is genocide, there's a good chance we're not going to the 2022 Beijing Olympics, Winter Olympics, in which case we'll encourage others to stay away as well. I'm not sure that China can really cooperate with us in these vital areas of common interest if we're going after them on human rights and encouraging others to see China in a primarily negative light. So it's going to be an attempt at cooperation. We'll see how it goes.
Matt, I want to ask you about, unless you want to comment on this notion of winning back credibility, I have something else I want to ask you about as well.
Go ahead, John.
Okay. So this Russian or the divided states of America, that's the term I was looking for. That's another theme that emerged, that everyone you spoke to had an acute awareness of how divided this nation appears to be, both from the inside looking out and from the outside looking in right now. And a lot of people would say that Russia has something to do with that, and not everybody sees it as a problem. Some see it as an advantage. Could you talk about this notion of the divided states of America, how that is viewed from Russia, and what the implications of that are for this new administration?
Sure. I think the essence of Russia's response to division, partisanship, polarization, inequality, injustice, and all of the other drivers of division in the United States is in the current US-Russia conflict. What has changed radically in the relationship between Moscow and Washington from, let's say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, when we, on both sides, routinely talked about partnership, talked about the possibility of Russia kind of joining the Western family of nations, be it NATO, be it the European Union, or something else, forming a new European security order, a la the Helsinki Final Act in the 1970s and the 1990 Charter of Paris, which Dan is leading some great work on now from his program. What has changed is that there's not any stakeholdership anymore in stability between Russia and the United States. From the Russian perspective, if the Americans are coming apart at the seams, that is basically an unalloyed good. And, I submit to you, I think it's an unfortunate state of affairs. I don't think it's well advised. But I think there are a lot of Americans, including American politicians, who in their heart of hearts would love to see nothing more than the Russian regime, spin into collapse. But the reality is, when you've got the world's two leading nuclear powers, literally with fingers hovering over the button and the ability to destroy the world in under an hour, you have to have some kind of stakeholdership in one another's stability. But that's just, we couldn't be farther from that today. And if I can add a point, John, as my colleagues were talking about expectations, realistic, unrealistic, elevated, lowered, I kept thinking to myself how irrelevant expectations end up being in US-Russia relations. They're always high, then they're always disappointed, then they're lowered, then you get surprised. What matters is developments in the world that are inherently unpredictable. So when a revolution of dignity takes place on the streets in Ukraine, which is neither organized by the CIA nor is a Kremlin plot, but is actually the Ukrainian people coming out in the streets and demanding change in their country and taking control of their future, that led to everything that has happened since 2014. It's been a fundamental break, an inflection point in human history. My concern, but also my expectation, is going to be that there will be more events like that. Can I predict for you exactly what they will be? No. But take a look at Belarus. There is a slow motion revolution in the streets taking place in Belarus now. There are some people who want to treat the Belarusian case from both the Russian side, frankly, and the Western side as another Ukraine, as another kind of geopolitical conflict. There are Belarusians pushing back very hard against that, saying, no, please, we don't want to go that route. We want to, find a place and live in peace in our neighborhood. We just want to get rid of this corruption and this oppressive authoritarian regime. So that's an example of, events could move much faster than expectations or policy from either Russia or the United States. And so, at the end of the day, I see some sources of continuity across US administrations that will continue in the Biden administration as well. The United States is not going to suddenly roll over on the issue of human rights abuses or bullying of Russia's neighbors. But on the other hand, I think it is very likely that developments in the world are going to catch us by surprise. It happens every time.
Matt, that's such a critical point that you make. I'm reminded of the John Lennon lyric of life is what happens when you're making other plans. There are limits to what we can foresee.
John Lennon, though, right?
John Lennon. Yes, John Lennon. That's right. I'm talking to the wrong guy when I invoke Lennon. I want to stick with this for a little longer, this theme of how we're viewed as a divided nation and what the implications are for our allies, our enemies, and for the Biden administration. Robert, a sub aspect of this that was a fascinating part of your interview was this notion that the U.S. has lost some moral authority when it comes to promoting a free press and its role in a society because of our mismanagement, or whatever you might call it, as it relates to social media and disinformation, and the weaponization of the term fake news by President Trump and his allies. Talk a bit about that and how that factors into the equation for the new administration.
Well, that was one aspect of Professor Zhao's comment that I thought was a little bit narrowly in China's self-interest. Obviously, they want to play up chaos because they see the American media as driving stories, not only here in the United States, but around the world. It is in China's interest to say that everything that comes out of the American media might be fake because of so much of it is focused on China. They need to be able to say that what we're saying about China in Hong Kong, for example, with the new national security law and really violating their agreements with England and making Hong Kong just another Chinese city, they want to be able to say that that is fake news. China needs to be able to say that what we say about the Uyghurs is fake news. That what we say about China's using technology to build out a surveillance state is fake news. So my guess is that even when whoever is in, or when President Biden is in the White House, he won't be using the phrase fake news very much. China's going to want to keep a flame under that as long as they can. It's in their interest to do so.
Cindy, Danielle Zavato talked about common agenda, seeking a common agenda, which in many ways is sort of the antithesis of America First, which might be the sort of projection of a divided America onto the global stage. What are your thoughts on this? And is that where we're headed? Will we make a U-turn and suddenly start talking about common agendas?
Well, I think there's certainly an opportunity to do that. Among other things, as Danielle mentioned, the United States next year will be hosting the Summit of the Americas, which every president since the beginning of the summits under the Clinton administration, every president has attended with the exception of President Trump, who went to Latin America once in the context of a G20 meeting that was being hosted in Argentina. So, you know, the truth is Latin America itself has never been more divided, more sort of disarticulated in terms of its own, you know, regional institutions and groupings. Most countries have turned inward as they try to address the catastrophe really on the public health side, on the economic side. And at the same time, there's a desire to see the United States once again take an important proactive and leadership role, not sort of, you know, again, lecturing Latin American countries which way to go, but really they're shoulder to shoulder partnering. And there's any number of issues that that could be on that agenda, including responding to the public health crisis, helping economies, you know, reactivate through greater investment, more trade, you know, all those kinds of things.
Thanks. Marissa, I know you wanted to come back to a point that Dan had made earlier, I think, about Iran. You have to unmute, Marissa. We're keeping score. That's one for you, one for Cindy on the Zoom tradition.
In terms of re-engaging in talks, I think Rami talked about this as well. So it's not obviously something that is welcomed by all in the region. it is important to engage the Europeans in that conversation, but there will be leaders, primarily of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and probably Bahrain, who would want this approach to be very different, would want a seat at the table, or would want to be consulted, which they always use that as a point to criticize the JCPOA for a few years ago when it was negotiated by the Obama-Biden administration. So there are definitely those in the region who are watching a little bit more closely, who are more cautious, not too optimistic. And going back to sort of the human rights and democracy points as well, we've already seen signs of not jitters, but I think just steps taken by countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia in at least announcements of releasing political prisoners. Erdogan recently talked about the rule of law, given after years of increased repression and limitations on freedoms. And so there is a recognition amongst those who have gotten away with a lot during the Trump years that they need to slowly recalibrate and refocus on human rights and democracy issues.
Thanks, Marissa. We are shockingly close to the end of our time, and that's always what happens in a good conversation. It moves very quickly. So I'm going to do something. I want to tee up. I want to go around with each of you and ask you the same question to end on. But before I do that, I'm going to ask Dan one more question. That way you'll have some time to gather your thoughts. And here's the question that I'm going to ask. When you're looking ahead for the Biden administration and you consider the expectations around the globe, not just necessarily in the regions that you are expert in, you can make your answer could address any of these areas. Question is simple. What is the biggest challenge immediately facing the Biden administration? And what is the biggest opportunity, maybe low-hanging fruit or someplace to gain some traction quickly for the Biden administration? Think about that. I'm going to buy you some time by asking Dan a question, because I don't want to let this slip by. Something that Norbert Röttgen said, Dan, was that great powers competition is moving more into a technology competition, which was a fascinating idea. Can you expand on that a bit, and then we'll go to our final round?
Yeah, it reflects the German debate that under the Trump administration, they felt they had been caught between China and the US, especially on the 5G debate and other things. But I think it reflects really a deeper trend that probably we all have to think harder about. That is, what's really shifting in this world? It's not just the territorial, geopolitical world we like to talk about. It's deep, deep trends having to do with innovation. Innovation in the digital world, we've seen innovation that is affecting our health and our health security. We've seen the whole nuclear world is entering a whole nother phase where the old rules don't really apply anymore. So this confluence of sort of the nuclear, the digital, and the biological, these are fundamental trends. They're about how we're connected and the flows that connect us as societies. It's not about states and territories. And that's not about more or less globalization. It's about the whole thing is being transformed. And I think it's a really fundamental how we think about that and who we think our partners are when we have to address those kinds of changes, because we don't even have the vocabulary right now to even describe those deeper trends that are going to affect all of us.
Thanks. Okay, so now we'll move to our final round, and that two-headed question. What is the greatest challenge right out of the chute that the Biden administration will face? And then what do you see as the greatest area of opportunity? Cindy, can we begin with you?
Sure. Well, without a doubt, I think the greatest challenge is going to be Venezuela. The Biden administration has been critical about the strategy of maximum pressure through absolutely crippling sanctions. But what can really be done to move Venezuela in a more democratic direction, it really remains to be seen. Anyway, there's also the huge challenge of these 5 million and growing Venezuelan refugees, primarily in the Latin American region, and the incredible presence and pressure this puts on countries like Colombia, and others that are home to these refugees. The biggest opportunity, I think, is to show, including as a way of competing with China in the region, that the United States has something to offer. This is a resource scarce kind of environment when foreign aid is not necessarily going to be that plentiful, but there are other things that the United States can do through stimulating investment through the Development Finance Corporation, to providing technological cooperation, and also to looking again at these high standard free trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Trump administration withdrew from on day one.
Thanks, Cindy. Robert.
I think that the greatest challenge is going to be balancing the domestic policy agenda under the Biden administration, which is what most Americans are concerned about, with this really daunting foreign affairs agenda that the president has. He has tried to bridge the two by saying that we need a foreign policy that works for the American middle class. That seems like a good broad framework, but we don't yet know what it means. He has also said, and this is what concerns me, why I say it's a challenge, that as president, Biden doesn't want to look at new free trade or economic agreements until he's increased the competitiveness of the American workers and improved infrastructure. There isn't time for that. Those are the tasks of years, possibly decades. Meantime, China is on the move. We've heard tonight about their activity in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe. They just completed this regional comprehensive economic partnership, which takes in a lot of America's allies, as well as the countries of Southeast Asia. So China is on the move. We can't wait until we fully get our house in order and our legs under us to deal with China and compete with China. We have to move on both fronts simultaneously. The opportunity is related to that, and it's the opportunity to strengthen alliances relatively quickly. This is fairly low-hanging fruit relative to China, because so many of our partners in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, around the world share our concerns about China's growing power.
Thanks, Robert. Monday. Monday, you've just tied the score. You've done it.
I was hoping not to get on your list, but here you go. I think from my perspective, a number of things. One, I think an administration definitely needs to focus on repairing some of the damage that has been done and restoring that normalcy that has been talked about. It's normalcy for many of the African countries. Second, I think a good thing is that the bipartisanship that we've seen in Africa is going to continue through the Biden administration. I'm hoping they can tap into that to build on some of the good programming that was established under previous administrations, including under the Trump administration. We had programs such as Prosper Africa and the Build Act that helped to expand the framework for economic engagement. So I'm hoping they can build on that. Number three is I hope a Biden administration is going to take the opportunity to revisit our long-standing framework of how we engage with Africa, to expand it even more and to amplify some of that engagement based on partnership and opportunity, and is plenty of opportunity. I think for too long, this country has sort of a foreign policy towards the African continent has been victim to low expectations of the continent. I think we need to revisit why those low expectations and really do an analysis of the opportunities that exist on the continent and some of the good stuff that's happening on the continent and how we engage with that. And I think a Biden administration can do that.
Thanks. Marissa.
Double strike. I think in terms of the challenge, it's actually to set the priorities for what to actually start with in the MENA region, precisely because the challenges are numerous. And Rami is correct in stating that the region has changed tremendously. There are very deep socioeconomic challenges, political disenfranchisement, layers and layers of complex issues, tectonic shifts in terms of the geostrategic situation in the region.
And he made the point that they even changed in the 4 years since Joe Biden's been out of office.
Absolutely. We've seen the changes at the outset of the Arab uprisings, but they've been more solidified with, as he mentioned, the Saudis and Emiratis taking a more aggressive role in the region, Turkey being emboldened beyond the MENA region, and then these new pathways to peace that we've seen that have changed dynamics, as well as protests that broke out last year, and very likely we will see more. So the challenge is to actually how to prioritize. The opportunity, I think, is a serious recommitment to political engagement in the region in order to address the challenges ahead, but also to perhaps be a little bit more involved in pushing for the political processes and the active conflicts that we have in Libya, Yemen, and in Syria, and ensure that the rhetoric is not only focused on sanctions and the threat of use of force. It's just going back to American diplomacy and more serious political engagement.
Thank you. Matt.
So the low-hanging fruit is very easy. By a stroke of the pen, President Biden can extend the New START nuclear agreement. He has said that he will do that. He will have roughly 2 weeks by the terms of the treaty within which to do that. And President Putin has said that he will support an extension with no preconditions. So I'm willing to go to the mat and say it's low-hanging fruit, literally a survival issue for the human species. So I'm fully in support. The
last major arms control agreement standing between the two nations, correct?
The last one standing. If you care about the thousands of nuclear weapons that are pointed at the places where we live, including Washington, D.C., you got to care about New START. But here's the challenge, and it's to take back control of U.S.-Russia policy in the executive branch of government, in the State Department, the National Security Council, the Defense Department, et cetera, and get it out of the politics. The last 4 years, Russia policy has been about limelight and politics and speeches and earning political currency. And the problem that President Biden will have is that his own party, including some of his closest allies, have been very much involved in that. And it's going to require a real about-face. People are going to look hypocritical to hand back control of Russia policy to the administration. But that said, with apologies to my friend and colleague Robert, this could be a Nixon goes to China moment. This could be a time where no one has the credibility to seek a reasonable, managed engagement with an adversary, which is at best what we would get between Washington and Moscow in 2021. No more so than the kind of air, if you will, of the Obama administration and of the Democrats and of the Hillary Clinton campaign. Much easier for a Democrat to do so now, I think, than a Republican.
Wow, that's a dramatic possibility, Matt. We'll see what happens. Dan, because you were generous to buy time for everyone to gather their thoughts for that last question, that leaves you with the final word.
Thanks, Matt. Well, I think it comes down to this age-old dilemma between the urgent and the important. The question will be, will the administration be carried away by urgent events one after another that it drags the agenda, or will it also be able to set in place a different type of structure that allows it to deal with the issues that Matt raised, unanticipated events, things you can't predict? If you have no frame, you get driven by those events rather than the other way around. When it comes to Europe, Joe Biden has said that Europe is, quote, our partner of first resort. That means instinctively, he's going to turn to Europeans to think about ways to address a lot of issues together with them. I think the challenge will be not to revert back to some old partnership, but to reinvent the alliance for something new, so that hopefully it could be more balanced, it could be more effective, and it could be more global. That's going to require a lot of us, but it will require more of Europe. And it's a positive potential, but we shall see whether Americans have the patience for that with the Europeans, and whether the Europeans have the will for that type of partnership.
Dan, thank you. And really, thanks to all of you. I can't tell you what a daily privilege it is to work with such a group of smart, engaged, and informed people. Learn something new all the time. I'm sure our viewers did as well. Thanks very much for everything you did today. Thank you to those of you who chose to join us for this event. We hope you enjoyed it and found it as educational as I did, and that you'll join us again soon. There's lots more where this came from. If you visit wilsoncenter.org, my colleagues and the people they work with are on it every day, and they've got lots of really fascinating and interesting and insightful information to share. So please visit us again at wilsoncenter.org, and we hope you'll also return for a future Wilson Center event. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.